What is going on, everybody? Art Eddie here for the Life of Dad show. We got a little bonus clip for you. Here's a preview of my interview with Alan Alda. It's just going to be showcasing me and him talking about his podcast, Clear and Vivid. There's a special episode that comes out next week on February 5th where he and his castmates from MASH all get together and reminisce about the iconic TV show that people still today are watching and sharing with their kids and their grandkids. If you're a big fan of Alan Alda or MASH, you're going to love this. And also stay tuned for the full episode of the Life of Dad show where I interview the one and only Alan Alda. Here's a quick little sample of that interview, and I hope you guys enjoy. Talk to you soon. Hey everyone, Art Eddie here for the Life of Dad show and online. I'm very happy to have the one and only Alan Alda. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me, sir. How you doing?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's such an honor. Big fan of your work. Before we get into fatherhood, I got to say, congrats on your podcast, Clear and Vivid, coming up next week. A special MASH podcast featuring members of the legendary TV show. Talk about the process of setting this up, because obviously, you've worked with your colleagues and all that, but trying to get time and dates locked down and like the idea. Talk a little bit about how you set this up to get this done for your podcast, sir.
You're right. It was a lot of doing. We get together at least once a year to have dinner, so we're in touch and in touch by email all the time. But to get together at one time to get access to a microphone or even a telephone to get together for the same podcast took a lot of doing. And then that wouldn't be bad enough. Jamie Farr almost lost his house in the big fire in California last month. And I think everything around him was burned down and his house was saved, but he couldn't get back into it for a while. And we had to postpone the podcast. We had advertisers set up for the podcast, and then they got all confused, and they didn't. So we had it sponsored instead by the Alda Center for Communicating Science, because it really makes sense, because this podcast with the MASH guys is so about what the theme of the show is, because the theme of the podcast is relating and communicating. And I found out things about how to relate to other people while we were doing MASH.
Yeah.
And I never understood before. And so that's partly what we'll be talking about. But then all these memories and reminiscences and stories come back up among us, and some of which I hadn't heard before, or I just couldn't remember.
Yeah. Definitely. Kind of speaking with that, I mean, there are shows like MASH that stand the test of time. I bet you get it all the time when, fans of the show come up to see you and they'll say, oh, I'm showing my son or my daughter, and, now they're showing their grandkids. Shows like MASH go from generation to generation. In your own opinion, why do you think MASH is still popular? Because, I think a lot of people have an idea, but I'd love to hear from you. Obviously, Hawkeye Pierce himself. But why do you think MASH is still popular today as it was when it first aired?
Well, there's no doubt that we had some of the best writing around, and wonderful directors, and a cast of actors that was very skilled and very talented. But I think people don't think about one of the elements that I think was essential was that we were doing stories about people who really lived. We did many hours of research, many hundreds of pages of research, talking to the people who had lived through MASH experiences, doctors and nurses. We combed through those transcripts looking for story ideas, and we tried to be respectful of their experience. And then there was this other thing that I was telling about a minute ago, about how we learned to relate as actors and as people. But as people first, we would sit around in a circle of chairs between shots. Sometimes you have to wait an hour or two while they're lighting the next set. And instead of going back to our dressing rooms and reading a book, we sat and looked each other in the face and kidded each other mercilessly until we were laughing.
Yeah.
And laughing hard, and that opening up to one another brought us together in a way that I'd never seen before. And we would carry that right onto the set that they had finished lighting and played the scene, but we had a connection that we wouldn't have had otherwise. We weren't just saying our lines at each other or pretending to be who we were in that situation. We were really still relating as people, and I think that showed, and I think that's one of the elements that made the show successful. When we talk about it a little bit in the get-together that we had on Clear and Vivid.
Yeah, I can't wait to listen to that. It's going to be great. And of course, we'll put up links here at Life of Dad for people to check out the Clear and Vivid podcast that Alan runs. Here at Life of Dad, we have the segment called Life of Dad Collector of the Week, kind of showing certain dads like what they're collecting. And one guy had this whole room dedicated to MASH. And obviously, there's it's amazing. It's really cool. And like this guy was all in on the show. There are certain characters that people can relate to. Obviously, Hawkeye Pierce was one of those characters. What did that? I mean, you've been in so many great movies, TV shows. When you look back, and obviously you had time to do that in your latest Clear and Vivid podcast with the crew from MASH. But when you look back on Hawkeye Pierce, what stands out most about that character or that experience that you'll always take away with you?
You know, it's funny. I almost always, when I act, since the time I was a very young actor, I've almost always taken away some aspect of the character that, when I played the character, represented some kind of growth for me, or some aspect that I was able to let out that I hadn't let out before. And I don't remember that happening in MASH. And the whole time I was playing MASH, I always resisted talking about the character in public. I think because I didn't want to get stuck with a definition that you could put into words. I wanted it to be a living association between me and the character. And I wanted to discover more things about the character as time went on. I didn't want to be limited by a definition I had on Monday when I might learn something on Wednesday that would broaden it. So I'm not good at talking about the character.
But that's probably one of the
reasons. I would be. I love to talk, but that's one subject I'm not so vocal on.
No, but the way you approach it, and especially that character, I guess that's probably why you didn't, I mean, the way it worked, the way you did it, obviously is proof in the pudding that it worked, and a lot of people gravitated toward liking Hawkeye. So thanks so much for doing that.
Thanks so much for listening to the Life of Dad show. You know where to find us, lifeofdad.com, and on Twitter and Facebook.
Noise you couldn't quite locate or explain. Couldn't quite locate.